Okay, I know some of you are familiar with the ATHAR project and the work that we do. I've put our handle at the bottom for those of you who are tweeting. It's pretty simple. It's just at ATHAR project. But our work focuses on looking at trafficking of cultural property on social media platforms. This is really something that we do on a volunteer basis. Myself and my co-founder, Amar Al-Azam, both have full-time jobs that are unrelated to this. And so this is what you're going to see here is years of collecting data and analyzing it in nights and weekends. We're partnered with UNESCO, the Day After Heritage Project, the Circulating Artifacts Project, and we're one of the founding organizations of the Alliance to Counter Crime Online. And I believe you've seen some members from that organization presenting today as well. So our work looks at the biggest tech platforms, the ones that essentially can do the most harm and also have some of the widest reach, particularly in the developing world. Obviously, this includes the Meta platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, Alphabet platforms, YouTube and Google Play. I'll give some examples of those today, and then to a lesser extent, TikTok and Twitter. But Facebook has been the primary thrust of our research. It is also the world's largest social platform. About a third of the world's population is on Facebook. And so it can also do the most significant harm as the platform fails to address any of these problems. I don't think I have to go through the harms with you guys because I think we've all seen over the past 2 years what those kind of harms can be. All the research that's done by the ATHAR project is completely open source investigation. So we're not using any sort of special tools. In fact, all of the data is manually collected. We do not scrape this data. I gave just some examples of images below that are just from the past couple months of artifacts that were being trafficked. And this is something that is really important when it comes to this kind of research because there is so much that can be missed in scraping, like in the comments below where people will divulge additional details, their contact information, their location that they may not have included in the post or may not be available in their profiles. So this kind of diligent investigation is really important for collecting all of the details necessary to get a full picture of what we're seeing on the platforms. Thus far, in the research that we've done, we've managed to collect over 12,000 images, probably more, but that was my last update. We're monitoring over 390 groups on Facebook and just as many pages, but the groups tend to be where the most significant activity is taking place. And those groups have a collective 12 million members, more than that now. In fact, as an example here, I circle a group that we've been monitoring, and this particular Facebook group has over 500,000 members, and it's only been operating for a couple years. So that gives you any indication of the scale here. Obviously, those of you who are aware, Facebook's been a pretty significant fueler of the illicit antiquities trade online globally, particularly in countries that are in conflict. And that's partially because it serves as the perfect digital trafficking toolkit. It offers up everything that a user would need to engage in trafficking through the platform. Disappearing stories to ensure there's no evidence, live streaming to ensure that you can get feedback while in the field. And the video you see here on the left is actually a live stream of a looter in Libya. And he was streaming from the field and soliciting inquiries from where and if he should keep digging as he was doing that activity. Of course, there's also the marketplace platform, the fact that Facebook algorithmically recommends content. There's in-platform payment and then encrypted messaging options. And that's including Facebook Messenger and not even just considering WhatsApp, which is also owned by Facebook. So just a few observations from the digital ethnography perspective. My background's in anthropology, so there are some really interesting just trends that we notice as we're identifying this activity. One that's really important is that users can reach an international audience, particularly for trafficking artifacts out of conflict zones. The artifacts you see here, the group on the left, I'm only leaving the group name unredacted because we have publicly identified this one before trying to get Facebook to remove it because it is so incendiary. They say artifacts are not for sale on the platform, yet here's a Facebook group that explicitly says artifacts for sale. And there you see a user's offering a flint tool. He explicitly says sending from Ukraine. He does want his payment through PayPal. And then on the right, you see metal artifacts. Again, both are being shipped, found metal detecting in Ukraine. And they'll ship them in the United States. And it's not just places like Ukraine. This is an item thanks to a tip from our colleague Damien Huffer in a group where he was monitoring human remains. This is a Western group. It's all in English, US, North America. And this is an artifact for Yemen, where a user from Yemen who listed himself in Yemen was actually reaching out, trying to find buyers. And so it's a really good example of how these war crimes can be facilitated by the platform and be perhaps unknowingly facilitated by users in the US who choose to engage with these traffickers. Obviously, for those of you that follow looting and trafficking, metal detecting is super popular. I'm sure Sam covered some of that in his talk. But metal detecting we see it globally, and we see a lot of the same trends like you see here from Thailand to Ukraine. Users will offer items on the platform directly from in the field. And you can see in the Thailand photo, he's actually, one of his colleagues is still metal detecting in the background of the image. The platforms are also used to solicit financing. So in places like Egypt, excavating can require a lot of heavy equipment, or in the case of a waterlogged tomb, require diving. So here's an example of a group that was set up just specifically for offering underwater services for those who find themselves with a waterlogged tomb that they want to loot. Usually the cost of this is a percentage of the sale of the items found, but these are a really common activity, very specific to Egypt because of the nature of the tombs there. I also wanted to give a brief overview of some of the trafficking activity that we've seen in Ukrainian Facebook trafficking groups. I do want to preface this with that we've been following several of these groups since years before the conflict. And so we were able to watch the group's activity from prior to the conflict, where it was essentially a hobbyist group for illegal activity, which was metal detecting and trafficking items, to becoming a group that still engaged in these activities, but in the midst of conflict, and how they utilize that online community. Again, this is more of an ethnological understanding of what's going on here. And so what we see here is one user wants to, he's highlighting their patch, and he thinks that they should add that Putin is a coward to their metal detecting group patch. Another one is we see a post where he's actually in the field at a firing position, and he decided to, he found an artifact and decided to include it in the group. We saw metal detecting being associated with nationalism and patriotism. Here, a metal detectorist after the war or after the start of the conflict, painted his metal detector to match the Ukrainian flag. And we also saw these metal detecting groups being used for war efforts. So as individuals were going to the front lines, this is when the territorial forces were requesting a metal detector in order to identify landmines while they were on the front. And within just a couple of days, users were able to field that request, and they did get a metal detector to the group. So this is where you see how a group that starts out with cultural property looting as a hobby as opposed to a necessity or subsistence activity, and how that has kind of translated through the conflict. In fact, in one popular group, we saw that, there's a lot of awareness of their prior activities. This particular user, I thought this was interesting because he said one day, he said that it's really time to hide all of his belongings because he never thought he'd be the one that would have to bury his items and hide them from an invading force. This is another one who was digging a mass pit, and he wrote, "I used to dig them up, now I dig them." We have redacted the faces of individuals in these posts as well. So this is all kind of leading to the point that trafficking in conflict zones is essentially streamlined and turbocharged by these platforms, and particularly a platform like Facebook that has some of the highest reach in parts of North Africa and the Middle East. Our initial report in May 2019 highlighted the fact that in the Syrian groups that we were able to fully document, the majority of material was either being offered directly from countries in conflict or countries bordering those in conflict. And this is a really important piece of digital evidence. Big tech companies like Facebook often claim that they can't preserve war crimes evidence because of data and privacy reasons. In fact, Facebook made this exact claim to ATHAR project when we encouraged them to preserve data that was reported to the platform after they passed their ban on antiquities and not just erase it. They told us that because of GDPR, they were not able to do that for privacy reasons. However, this past May, the European Council, in response to the war in Ukraine, adopted a mandate that allows Eurojust to preserve, analyze, and store any evidence relating to international crimes such as war crimes. So that excuse no longer flies, particularly when we're looking at Europe, because the European Council has approved the preservation of war crimes evidence. And we've seen this kind of evidence used before. Those of you who followed the destruction of the tombs in Timbuktu in Mali that were posted online, the videos, it was video of that tomb destruction that was used as critical evidence to help convict Ahmed al-Faqi al-Mahdi for his role in that activity. And we've seen Facebook videos too, an ICC trial of a Libyan National Army commander, al-Warfali. This is a video of war crimes that was uploaded directly to Facebook. Facebook did remove it, but it was preserved by Bellingcat, which is another organization that does incredible open source investigative research. Highly recommend if you have not seen them before. But these are just examples of how critical even just a single piece of evidence can be. And that's why we make an effort to preserve everything that we do. Just like we want to preserve artifacts in C2, we want to preserve this digital evidence in C2. That's why when you see screenshots, you're seeing them with the context of the date. Usually we take the screenshot of the full screen, so you'll see the group and the rest of the context, but I've shortened them here for PowerPoint purposes. But starting with Afghanistan, obviously a lot of the artifacts we see offered in these trafficking groups mirror what's on the market. With the exception of this March post, these other posts were all offered these Afghan artifacts were all offered after the fall of Kabul and the retreat of US troops. And it's not just artifacts. This is an antiquities trafficking group where we have reported grenades being trafficked from Afghanistan. We see from April and January of this year on the left, those are actually US military issued hand grenades. I looked up the information on them, and those are being openly trafficked through Facebook through an antiquities trafficking group. In places like Iraq, we also see, again, mirroring what's on the market, incantation bowls, cuneiform artifacts. Similarly, in Libya, we're seeing a lot of Roman material. And then in places like Myanmar, which is also in conflict and is actually being investigated for its role in the Rohingya genocide, we also see trafficking of Buddhist artifacts out of Myanmar. In Syria, we are continuing to see mosaics and bus traffic. So you see these initial posts on the left go back to 2019, but the one on the right, I just reported last month. Some of you may have seen these videos before as well. These are videos of the same mosaic that we tracked across these Facebook groups. On the left was the video of the mosaics, what was still in C2. We were able to see each of the individual items while they were still in the ground. You can see they obviously haven't been looted. And this unique face is one that we zeroed in on because when we paused the videos of the removed and not removed mosaics, we were able to see that they were the same item, about a little over a year apart. And they had been, this item had been moved from the ground to Turkey for trafficking. Again, as I mentioned, Ukraine, lots of metal detecting, so no surprises that what we're seeing are coins, metal seals, arrowheads. In Yemen, we're seeing a variety of objects. These are some older images, but more frequently we're seeing things like manuscripts being offered. And there's also the issue of designated terror groups marketing artifacts. I'm not sure if anybody followed the Clooney Foundation's The Docket. They recently released a significant report about the role of terrorist groups and antiquities in terror finance. And that's something that we repeatedly see on Facebook. Here is an example from December. This is a user in Gaza City. His Facebook profile makes very clear that he is a supporter of Al-Qassam Brigades, which are a faction of Hamas, a designated terrorist group. And he's posting a video of a mosaic in situ that has not yet been looted, but it likely is now. We've also seen individuals in the Taliban engaged in trafficking. And what's notable about this one is the individual we identified who is in the Pakistani Taliban. He asked the price of this Gandharan piece. And a lot of suggestions about Taliban rule have stated that the Taliban will re-engage in looting. But the Taliban's value when it comes to illicit activity is really in the networks they've established over the past 30 years, particularly when it comes to their opioid smuggling networks. So it would make the most sense that Taliban individuals will engage in middleman activities and the moving of an artifact as opposed to the actual looting, because their value is in their networks. Again, we're seeing a similar militant activity from users in Iraq that are trafficking artifacts. This is an example of an ISIS-affiliated user that was offering coins, I believe, in the Syrian group. Again, Libya as well. This is an individual who makes no, makes militant affiliations, if you can tell by the photo. But he claimed, based on his job listing, that he worked at the 32nd Reinforced Brigade, which was a unit of Gaddafi loyalists. And then in Yemen, similarly, we're seeing the Southern Liberation Front, which is one of the factions fighting in Yemen, engaging in trafficking of coins. So some of you probably have some thoughts after those. First thought, have you shared this or spoken with Facebook? Yes, we have. We spoke to Facebook in 2019 after our initial report came out. We were really hopeful since they had decided that they were going to create a policy at that time regarding the trafficking of antiquities. About a year later, when that policy was about to take place, we spoke to them again and were essentially informed that the policy was they would not be preserving any data. They wanted volunteers to train their machine learning, even though they're a multi-billion-dollar company. And ultimately, what we saw is the same type of PR window dressing we've seen time and again, whether we're talking about wildlife trafficking, antiquities trafficking, white nationalism, all of these things that the company promises to fix or has policies on but chooses not to. If a company like Facebook removes these groups, that won't solve looting. Won't traffickers just move to another platform? Of course, more high-level traffickers will move to another platform, but other platforms like Telegram, for instance, or WhatsApp, even, the problem is that you can't easily search to join groups in those platforms. Furthermore, Facebook has a unique penetration in the developing world because it ran zero-rated data and free internet programs that essentially violated net neutrality and gave a truncated version of the internet, where Facebook was often one of the only apps that could be used under these zero-rated data programs, giving them a larger share of the responsibility here. But just like the group I showed you with over 500,000 members, you will never find any sort of Telegram chat or any other platform that has a scale on that level in terms of membership. Isn't this just too big of a problem for companies to handle? Obviously, many of you have been working for a decade or decades on antiquities trafficking issues. It came around long before the platforms. It's been around for 1,000 years. But it's not too big of a problem for these platforms to handle. We're talking about some of the most well-resourced, sophisticated technology companies in the world. And it's a matter of willingness, not ability. And what we've seen time and again as members of ACCO is that there's significant expertise where a small number of people can make a huge impact and really identify this research in a very specialized way, but the company is not investing in those individuals. So why don't the platforms just remove this content? That'll be easier. It stops the PR fires, right? The answer is profit. And that's really the takeaway I want you to get today. Ultimately, it's not just the traffickers that can profit from these activities, it's the platforms too. And making an effort to clean up one activity isn't just a financial investment to ensure the platform is clean, but it also cuts into the profit margins for the companies. Here, this is very obvious. I mentioned Facebook created a very broad description that you can't buy, sell, trade any historical artifacts. Awesome. But even after repeated attempts to report artifacts that specifically had prices or were offered for sale, Facebook would not remove the content. This shows that there is really no effort put into the content moderation efforts. And it's another example of the fact that this was simply a PR move. And despite the fact that Facebook's banned the sale of antiquities, we see things like this, where if you go to your interest categories on Facebook, it will tag our Antiquities Trafficking user for interest in things like treasure hunting. This is not the first time we've seen this. In August 2020, for instance, in my work, my day job, where I look at domestic extremism on Facebook, Protect Transparency Project, Facebook had banned domestic militia groups in the United States and militarized social movements from the platform explicitly. Yet 3 months after the January 6th insurrection, Facebook was still using militia as an ad interest targeting category. It's the exact same problem that we're seeing here in terms of failure to enforce policies. Now, again, not only is Facebook failing to enforce the policies on this, but it's taking money from companies that are offering artifacts for sale in direct violation of its policies. And Facebook even has a image scanner to scan your photos for items that may be relevant to certain brands. And we see this in action all of the time. A papyrus ad will come up right after we've scrolled past papyrus. Here we have ancient coins in the form of rings for sale right after we scrolled past coins. And Facebook doesn't just profit from the advertising, it's also profiting from the Facebook shop that these items are being sold. Actually get a cut of any Facebook shop sale. So if you purchase this ring for $3,900, not only is this a violation of Facebook's policies, but they're profiting from their failure to enforce those policies. Again, we see the same thing with Facebook Marketplace. This is a genuine Egyptian coffin piece that was sawed in half and offered for sale within the United States. And Facebook was monetizing this as well with an ad. But it's not just Facebook. Google also profits from trafficking. We've recorded at least a dozen different applications on Google Play that are you can purchase through the platform. And some of these applications also run ads within them that allow them to be monetized both by Google and the creator. Now, these applications that I'm mentioning are notable because they're all based in the Middle East, and they're all specific to looting and trafficking of antiquities, activities that are largely illegal in many of these countries. You see, this one was installed 10,000 times. This is another one where if you have an artifact available, you can send your picture to, they claim, Christie's, who will contact you, when in reality, it's a trafficker. And they even put in the description of the application, don't share it with people who are not trustworthy. So they're aware that this application is engaging in illegal activity. And it's YouTube as well. I know that there have been some presentations here on YouTube already, but what we found is that YouTube is monetizing a lot of videos of looting, not just trafficking. That means that even without a sale, looters can make money. Now, this is an image that does contain human remains. We've blurred it here, but we're trying to illustrate the fact that this is an individual who is explicitly looting a grave, and he never has to sell anything from this looting because Facebook has monetized this video with ads. And so YouTube, YouTube and this creator both are profiting each time somebody views this video long after the site has been looted. We see the same thing in Ukraine. This is another example. Users will go to a Facebook group with thousands of members, direct them to their YouTube page where the video is monetized, and then they hope that those thousands of members will watch their video, further monetizing them with the number of views. And we see a similar activity when it comes to that cross-platforming with TikTok. Here, this is a TikTok user with 9.6 million members. Most of his videos are largely fake. They're bait videos to make it look like he's finding discovery, but right before you can see what you want to see on TikTok, the video goes dark, and they direct you to the full videos on their YouTube channel, which are all monetized with ads, which is how he's able to monetize that 9.6 million person following on TikTok. So there's a lot of problems here. Many of them are probably way beyond the scope of what people think of when they're in archaeology. And working in tech policy for several years now, I have a different perspective, and I think it's given me a different view on how to address these problems. First of all, it's important to remember you are taking on big tech. Facebook only responded to this issue because of the PR fires that were created. When you have something that shows a significant negligence on the part of a major corporation, it's important to make that public. And that doesn't just mean through academic research papers, but being able to translate your findings for a wider audience, whether that is reaching out to journalists who can help do that translation for you and write an article about your work, or whether that means working with lawyers. There are a lot of opportunities in litigation and policy and advocacy where researchers should be reaching outside of their bounds, because your knowledge, your subject matter expertise is extremely valuable. And there are people who know how to turn that into action. So that means looking at consumer protection litigation, targeting advertisers whose materials are being offered alongside this illegal activity, and even looking at violations of the US Anti-Terrorism Act. We have clear evidence that Facebook has been facilitating terror finance through the trafficking of these artifacts. And a great example of using this kind of creative legal eye is a YouTube or an ACCO member called Ladies Freethinker, which is an animal NGO, has recently sued YouTube over animal abuse videos. Now, YouTube, like many other tech platforms, don't have really any legal or civil liability because of Section 230, which immunizes them from any of that liability. So the YouTube case didn't go after them for Section 230 content, but essentially for failing the consumers and failing to hold up their end of their terms of service by not addressing all of the types of harmful content they were profiting from on their platform. And that kind of pressure, as well as international pressure, fines, and policy changes, including coordination across borders. And you have colleagues in the UK, in Europe, and in Canada that are working on legislation on these issues. Make sure that you share and engage with them, because that kind of knowledge can really help some of these bigger tech questions that are being answered right now. And so really taking on big tech means turning outside of your comfort zone of academia and turning to experts in policy, advocacy, and other areas of investigative research to figure out how to best make the impact and address these issues. I really appreciate you guys